In this lecture for Module 3, I want to focus on Chapter 5 from Whitehead's Science and the Modern World, the Romantic Reaction. In this chapter, Whitehead shows how by the 19th century, after a few hundred years of the modern scientific view of a mechanistic universe, there arose a reaction, and it was a reaction that came through the arts and literature and poetry, because as Whitehead put it, nature poets like Wordsworth were protesting against the idea that the mechanistic picture of nature captured the concreteness of the world, of the universe. Wordsworth believed that the scientific view left something crucial out, and so he more or less rejected, or at least ignored, the scientific perspective. Whitehead doesn't want to ignore or reject the scientific perspective. He wants to reform it, and he believes that he has provided a new cosmological scheme that is rooted in organism rather than mechanism, and that this organic cosmology allows the values defended by the Romantic poets to find some coherent place within our broader conception of the universe and within our scientific conception of the universe. So Whitehead discusses in this chapter the way that the modern scientific materialistic picture of a mechanistic universe led to a radical inconsistency in modern thought, because on the one hand you've got this scientific realism rooted in mechanism, and on the other hand you've got these new political movements rooted in a desire for freedom and democracy that are based in the idea of a kind of moral realism, that human beings have a conscience, have freedom, and that we can hold one another responsible in the context of our civil societies. And, if nature is mechanical, and if our bodies are a part of nature, it becomes quite perplexing to try to understand how the soul might have some influence over the behaviors and activities of the body. Where is the soul, the human soul, in the context of this giant world machine? For Whitehead, this was the great perplexity haunting the modern world. And because of the inconsistency, he said that modern thought was enfeebled. There was no coherent cosmological picture which could integrate the freedom of the soul and the mechanism of nature. Whitehead will refer to Tennyson's poem In Memoriam early in his chapter as an example of the perplexity and the muddledness that many 19th century thinkers had in regard to this contradiction. Tennyson is still trying to hold tight to a religious orientation, but in his poem, and I'm going to read a few stanzas here, you can see his struggle to both acknowledge what scientific materialism has purported to have revealed about the nature of the universe, and at the same time that he wants to remain faithful to a religious conception of the world. So I'm going to read this, and then I want to show how it relates very much to Immanuel Kant's transcendental philosophy. Kant did try to offer some coherent understanding of how there could at the same time be a mechanical nature and a free self-determining soul. But as I'll also try to spell out, that compromise, the Kantian compromise, if you will, ends up being just as incoherent as any other view to emerge in this perplexing modern period. So Tennyson writes, "Strong Son of God, immortal love, whom we that have not seen thy face, by faith and faith alone embrace, believing where we cannot prove. Thine are these orbs of light and shade. Thou madest life in man and brute. Thou madest death, and lo, thy foot is on the skull which thou hast made. Thou wilt not leave us in the dust. Thou madest man, he knows not why. He thinks he was not made to die, and thou hast made him. Thou art just. Thou seemest human and divine, the highest, holiest manhood thou. Our wills are ours, we know not how. Our wills are ours to make them thine. Our little systems have their day. They have their day and cease to be. They are but broken lights of thee, and thou, O Lord, art more than they. We have but faith. We cannot know, for knowledge is of things we see, and yet we trust it comes from thee, a beam in darkness, let it grow. Let knowledge grow from more to more, but more of reverence in us dwell, that mind and soul, according well, may make one music as before, but vaster. We are fools and slight. We mock thee when we do not fear, but help thy foolish ones to bear, help thy vain worlds to bear thy light. So those are the first several stanzas from Tennyson's long poem, In Memoriam. Later in this poem, he'll say that he'll refer to the way that the stars blindly run, as Whitehead will quote. It's also in this poem that famous phrase that nature is red tooth and claw was first articulated. And this poem was published before Darwin's theory of evolution became popular, before Darwin published The Origin of Species, but it was immediately seized upon as the proper description of the Darwinian view of nature, right, as red tooth and claw. So Tennyson is struggling with this modern perplexity in this poem, and what he has to say about the relationship between faith and knowledge, it really reminded me of Kant and what he says in the preface to the Critique of Pure Reason, where Kant says that he was forced to limit knowledge in order to make room for faith. And what he means by that is that with his transcendental method of philosophy, he limited scientific knowledge to the realm of phenomena, and said that what lies beyond phenomena, beyond the realm of appearances, is something he called noumenal, the things in themselves, and we can have no knowledge of those things. And Kant would refer both to the moral law within him and to the starry heavens above him as examples of the sublime, the way that beyond our phenomenal experience, beyond the realm of appearances, there is an infinite beyond and an infinite within. And because science, according to Kant, can know nothing about these twin infinites, it preserves some space for faith, preserves some room for religion. It's not the kind of religion that we could have metaphysical knowledge about, right? After Kant, if we accept the Kantian compromise, if you will, between scientific knowledge and religious faith, there is no more theology, really. We can't have knowledge of God. We can't really have knowledge of the soul either, because freedom is not a category of our understanding. It's not something that our mind can grasp according to the mechanical principles that it uses to grasp the natural world. And I'm going to share some other lectures with you in this module where you can explore with me in a lecture I gave a couple years ago on Kant and Whitehead, explore more the way that Kant revolutionized the way that philosophers had been conceiving of the mind's relationship to reality, and how Whitehead tries to overcome this Kantian form of idealism, where we only have knowledge of appearances. And Kant himself got close to breaking out of this, bifurcated understanding of reality, where there's a phenomenal realm that we can have access to and know, and a noumenal realm beyond that. Kant almost breaks through when he, in his final critique, the critique of judgment, begins to explore beauty and aesthetics and the place of purpose in the organic biological world. Kant famously said that there would never be a Newton of the grass blade. That, in other words, we'd never have a mechanistic understanding of even a mere blade of grass or of any organism in the biological world. And so while everything else in nature can be understood mechanically, at least and everything else in apparent or phenomenal nature can be understood apparently for Kant, can be understood mechanically for Kant, organisms could not be. Because an organism, unlike a mechanical system, is one in which the parts do not determine the whole determines the parts. And all of the parts exist for the sake of the whole. And organisms strive to realize purposes and ends. Whereas inorganic nature cannot be said to, or at least we can't understand it as purposeful, according to Kant. And what changes for some of the post-Kantian thinkers like Friedrich Schelling, most significantly, is that organism becomes characteristic of the whole of nature. And rather than accepting with Kant that Newton's picture of nature as mechanical was adequate, Schelling replaces it with an organic picture of nature, an ensouled picture of nature. And again, I get more into this in the other lectures that I'm sharing with you in this module. And Whitehead is really following in that same tradition, the tradition of Schelling. And in the essay that you'll read by Michael Heller, you'll see that he criticizes Schelling and his natural philosophy quite severely as not really contributing much to science. But if you read the longer essay that I'm suggesting you read, but not requiring, by Aaron Gare, called From Kant to Schelling to Process Philosophy, I believe. In that essay, you'll see that there are many other scholars who credit Schelling with being a forerunner for 20th century paradigms like complexity theory, and certainly a forerunner of the evolutionary theory of nature prior to Darwin. That in many ways, Schelling also provided the conceptual basis for what became the theory of electromagnetism later in the 19th century that Clerk Maxwell articulated. And Faraday also played a role and was influenced by Schelling. So I would want to caution you in accepting Heller's perspective at face value. I shared the essay because it's not an uncommon perspective to dismiss Schelling's relevance and to say that he held back science. But the alternative form of organic science and the organic cosmology that Schelling articulates is very much in line with what Whitehead will end up trying to do in the 20th century. And, if you want to criticize Schelling's understanding of science, maybe you can. I suppose it might be justified on some level, even though he was pretty up to speed on the state of physics and chemistry and biology in his own day. You can't question the scientific or mathematical chops of Whitehead. He was, at the leading edge of the advance of mathematics and geometry and projective geometry and universal algebra, and he was right in the middle of the discussion of Einstein's new theory of relativity and the new quantum theories. No one could understand the 20th century revolutions in natural science and mathematics better than Whitehead. So, his inheritance of this organic conception of nature out of the natural philosophy of Schelling is important to recognize, but Whitehead wasn't directly influenced by Schelling. He does excerpt a few lines from Schelling about how the subject and the object are in this sort of dialectical relationship with one another in his book, The Concept of Nature, I believe. But other than that, he doesn't make much reference to Schelling. But many of his friends, his scholarly friends, were influenced by Schelling and the broader German idealist movement, and so in conversation with them, he sort of came to understand at secondhand this Schellingian perspective, and also through the poetry of William Wordsworth, who was deeply influenced by his friend Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who himself traveled to Germany, studied German idealism, learned German, came back and translated much of Kant's and Fichte's and Schelling's work into English, sometimes without attribution. Schelling forgave him for that because he appreciated how insightfully Coleridge was translating his ideas, Schelling's ideas, into English. But it was through Coleridge's appropriation of Schelling and Coleridge's influence on Wordsworth that Whitehead, sort of in a circuitous way, had these organic ideas fed into him, into his thought. Wordsworth, according to some, had as much impact on Whitehead's outlook as did Plato. Whitehead would read Wordsworth's Prelude daily, apparently, according to the testimony of his daughter. And in this chapter, you'll see his clear preference for Wordsworth. He also enjoys Shelley. But there's something about the nature poetry of Wordsworth that captures Whitehead's own protest against the overly abstract mechanistic picture of nature. And as part of the reading for this module, I also shared an essay of my own that tries to draw some explicit connections between Wordsworth's poetic statements and Whitehead's metaphysical scheme. Whitehead's reliance on Wordsworth is based on his belief that Wordsworth provides a solid poetic argument that the important facts of nature elude the scientific method, because the mechanistic view of nature wants to, it's bifurcated, right? Where there are objective facts, the primary qualities of things, which are just the, their dimensions, their length, width, and height, their mass, their momentum, and so on. And then there are the secondary qualities, which are tastes and colors, textures, all the things added by the human subject and the perceptions of the organism. And this view of nature as denuded of all of its subjective quality is, in fact, inhibiting science from gaining a true picture of what the world is, according to Wordsworth and according to Whitehead. But rather than just reject science, Whitehead again wants to reform it, to place it on an organic basis rather than a mechanistic basis. Because, as the Romantic poets knew and as Whitehead argued, nature cannot be divorced from its aesthetic values. For Whitehead, the very texture of reality is an achievement of value. Every fact in nature is also the achievement of a value, and every fact in nature is, the result of an actual occasion of experience, right? So as we've discussed already in prior modules, experience pervades the natural world for Whitehead, and the fact that there is anything in particular at all is the result of some form of aesthetic harmony or achievement of value that allows the thing to endure as what it is. So Whitehead will say that value is the word I use for the intrinsic reality of an event. His view of nature as composed of a series of interlocking events and as an evolutionary adventure is his way of accounting for where the order of nature comes from. And he'll point out towards the end of this chapter that to just say that God provides the order of nature is it's a lack of effort on behalf of rationality to provide a more legitimate explanation. It's too easy. And what Whitehead says is that, and I quote, "We have to search whether nature does not in its very being show itself as self-explanatory. By this I mean," he continues, "that the sheer statement of what things are may contain elements explanatory of why they are." Right? And he then goes on to say that the general aspect of nature is that of evolutionary expansiveness. What nature is an expansionary, evolutionary process. Expansionary in the sense both of how we think of the Big Bang cosmology, an inflationary universe, but also expansionary in the sense of ever-increasing forms of complexity and diversity constantly emerging. And the universe is an unending creative expression that builds on itself, right? So he'll say that the problem of evolution, and I'm quoting Whitehead from the end of chapter 5, the problem of evolution is to develop enduring harmonies of enduring shapes of value which merge into higher attainments of things beyond themselves. So aesthetic attainment is interwoven in the texture of realization. This, for Whitehead, is the lesson of the Romantic nature poets, and scientists need to take heed of their poetic insights into the nature of reality and the nature of the universe. Their protest against the bloodless view of nature coming out of the mechanistic picture of nature is a valid one, and Whitehead makes a pretty strong case for that, I believe, in this chapter, while at the same time faulting and criticizing some Romantic poets, especially Keats, for rejecting science outright and just dismissing it because it doesn't align with their own moral intuitions. We need to preserve the scientific outlook, but we need to reform it, right? And that's the challenge that Whitehead is calling himself to meet. And Science in the Modern World was one of the first books that Whitehead wrote after he came over to the United States to teach at Harvard. And it's after this book that he really began work in earnest on his magnum opus, Process and Reality, where the full complexity of his novel cosmological scheme is articulated. I want to also just briefly talk a bit about how Whitehead mentions, he doesn't call them this yet, but eternal objects. He discusses eternality, and his example of the way that eternality participates in the temporality of nature is color. Right? He says, a color is eternal. It haunts time like a spirit. It comes and it goes. But where it comes, it is the same color. It neither survives nor does it live. It appears when it is wanted. So this is a strange thing for a process philosopher to say, right? A color is eternal. It haunts time like a spirit. And many thinkers who discover Whitehead's thought and expect that a process relational ontology would be all about temporal events bleeding into other temporal events, is surprised that one of the most important concepts in his system is this notion of eternal objects, and color is an example. He's a mathematician as well, so mathematical objects are another example of eternal objects that participate in nature but cannot be reduced to or cannot be said to emerge from the flow of events. Rather, they appear when they are wanted. Whitehead is not a traditional Platonist in the sense that he thinks that what's most real are these eternal objects, these eternal forms, which would be perfect, and everything temporal and physical would just be a mere imitation. He rejects that. For him, the actual world of experience is what is most real, and these eternal forms, these eternal objects, they lack actuality, and they depend upon the world of actual experience for their realization. But the actual world also depends upon these eternal objects for its definiteness, right? So when we refer to the color yellow, we experience the same shade of yellow across multiple events, right? Another example would be a musical score. We can hear it performed by a variety of orchestras, but it's the same musical score, right? And it's not that the musical language itself is the eternal form. That language is just a symbol pointing at the form, the eternal form of that particular song, that particular piece of music. But the fact that we can hear the same piece of music multiple times is what Whitehead is getting at. It's the sameness that needs an explanation, and for Whitehead the explanation is this notion of an eternal object. So he's introducing it here in this chapter for the first time, and we'll continue to return to this as we get deeper into the categories that Whitehead creates in order to articulate a more organic understanding of the cosmos. So I'll end this lecture there, and I encourage you to take a look at least the other lecture I shared called The Critique of Pure Feeling on Kant and Whitehead. And if you feel like you need some more background on Kant and the German idealists that came after Kant and really set the groundwork for the romantic reaction that Whitehead discusses, you should also take a look at the series of videos from my German idealism course. I think the diagrams I developed there might be helpful. So yeah, please take note of any questions that came up for you during the readings or during this lecture, and ask them in the discussion or during our Zoom video conference. All right, thanks for listening.